Well, hello, confirmands. This is year 3, lesson 4 on the Apostle Peter. There are 13 stories that I want you to know about the Apostle Peter. Do you have to know all 13? Yeah, you should know all 13 stories. They are written in the notes that go next to this video. Here's the thing, you should already know them. That if you look at your reading chart for October, you see here where it says on the 17th, a serious problem. That is the last story that is in your reading about Peter. We're going to be looking at this video together on the 28th. If you don't know these stories, it means that you are more than 11 days behind already. So listen, this video is going up on a Friday. You have time this weekend. Just read 3 or 4 little stories a day. You'll be completely caught up. You will feel better about yourself, and you'll know what we're talking about. So we're talking about the Apostle Peter. There's 13 stories. I'm going to repeat it at the end, but the assignment is I want you to pick one of these 13 stories, and I want you to write me a paragraph about the story. What is it? And let's not do one of the 4 that I'm going to cover today. So of the other 9 stories that I don't cover today, I want you to write me a little paragraph, what the story's about, who does what. You know what a paragraph is, 5 or 6 sentences. This is not the end of the world. Just do it. The other thing I want you to do is I want you to give me one question, something that you're wondering about. It can be from one of the stories that I'm giving you here. It can be from one of the 9 that you researched on your own, but I want a paragraph from you and I want a question from you. That's where we are. If you've got 8 questions, that's fine, but I need at least 1. So, the Apostle Peter. Peter was one of the disciples that Jesus chose. He chose him very early. He was one of the first 4 disciples that Jesus chose. He was with Jesus the entirety of Jesus' life and ministry. You're aware, I hope, that at the end of Jesus' life, Peter did a really bad job. He caved. He fell apart. That Peter was asked 3 times if he knew Jesus, and 3 times he denied that he even knew him. And what makes it even worse is that Jesus had predicted that this would happen, and Peter had said, absolutely not. Even if I have to die with you, I won't do that. Jesus said, you're going to do it this night before the rooster crows. And sure enough, that very night, Peter denied Jesus 3 times. So Jesus dies. Peter is horrified. He's crushed at his failing. Right? Jesus comes back to life. There are the interactions on that first night in the upper room. There's the interactions a week later where the apostles are there and Thomas joins them. Remember, all these stories should be familiar to you. But then some time passes, and you can read about this in John 21. But Peter decides he's going to go fishing. And he picks 6 of the other guys, and they all go fishing. And they fish all night, and in the morning the sun's coming up, and they see someone on the shore, and they don't know who it is, right? The light is bad, and they're 100 yards off. And the person on the shore says, did you catch anything? And they say, no. And he says, throw the nets on the other side. So they throw the nets on the other side, and wham! They just are filled with fish, just an incredible hit of fish. They got a whole school of fish at one time, and they're struggling to keep the boats from capsizing. And John looks at Peter and he says, it's the Lord. And Peter looks up and he looks at the fish. He quickly puts some clothes on. He jumps into the water. He swims to shore. He's got business that he has to attend to with Jesus. The others come. They drag the fish. There's 153 fish. That's a symbolic number. Our Jewish neighbors at that time believed that there were 153 nations in the world, so there's some symbolism there that Jesus is going to catch all the fish that can be caught. Right? But they gather on the shore. Jesus has built a fire. He cooks them breakfast. They eat together. And then Jesus looks at Peter and he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, you know I love you. And Jesus says, tend my lambs. Little time goes past, and Jesus looks at Peter again and he says, Peter, do you love me? And Peter says, yeah, of course I love you. And Jesus says, feed my sheep. A little time passes, and Jesus again looks at Peter and he says, Peter, Do you love me? Now, you're smart. You understand what's going on here. Peter denied Jesus 3 times. Jesus is giving Peter 3 chances to undo that in his own head. I mean, Jesus already knows everything that he needs to know, but Peter needs to undo it in his head. Peter, do you love me? Peter's feelings are really hurt. And he says, you know that I love you. And Jesus says, tend my sheep. Gives him a job. We're okay. You and I, we've worked this out. Now you've got work to do, and you have a lot of work to do. And then Jesus tells Peter, he says, someday you're going to be taken someplace you don't want to go, and your arms are going to be stretched out. You're going to be someplace you don't want to be. And we think, the author of the Bible thinks, or the author of the Gospel of John thinks, that Jesus was telling Peter how he was going to die. We'll get there in just a few minutes, you and me. But Jesus shows up, and he fixes things with Peter. He gives him another chance, and then he gives him a job. It's a weird story at the end, because then Peter looks at John and he goes, well, how about him? And Jesus says, it's none of your business what's going to go on with him. If he's going to live until I come back, that's between me and him. And so a rumor starts that John will never die. But John, in the Gospel of John, you look, John 21, at the very end, says, Jesus didn't say I wasn't going to die. He said that if he chose not to have me die, that was his business between me and him, and it was none of Peter's business. So, the squabbling, the ordinary human interactions, all that's preserved for us. And when you see that, it might make you feel like these people are more real. These are people that you can trust. These are people like us. All right, so Jesus and Peter are back on the same page. You're going to read these stories yourself. You're going to go through these stories yourself. But one of the ones that you'll probably trip on, that you'll probably want to talk about, it's called sharing in the early church in Eggemeyers. It's in Acts 4 and Acts 5. But the deal is that the church was made up of people who had been strangers, some of them very poor, some of them very rich. And there was a period there where if people had property or if they had money, they would just give it to the apostles, and the apostles would take care of everyone. That everybody shared what they had, it was all in common, and that people then were fed and clothed. You understand that this wasn't compulsory, right? Some people will say that the early church was communist, right? The early church practiced a radical kind of sharing, but there was nothing compulsory about it. You didn't have to do it. And that's an enormous difference. But people were moved by the love of Christ to sell their possessions and to share them with one another. And many did. Many would bring everything that they had realized from the sale of something and give it to the apostles, put it at their feet, and then it would be distributed. But there was a couple, Ananias and Sapphira. They had a field. They sold the field, and then they came up with a plan that they were going to make a big show of giving the money to the apostles, but they were going to just pretend that it was everything they had gotten, when in fact they kept something back for themselves. Keep in mind, they could have kept it all for themselves. They weren't being forced to do anything. They could have put 10% of it at the feet of the apostles and said, there's something from the field that we sold. The apostles wouldn't have said, well, what percentage is it exactly? No, they lied, right? So Ananias comes and he puts this money at Peter's feet, and he says, this is everything we got from the field we sold. And Peter said, you think you're lying to me, but you're not lying to me, you're lying to God. And there's a penalty for lying to God. And Ananias fell down dead. And the young men picked his body up and took it out to bury it. A few hours later, Sapphira, the wife, came in, and Peter said to her, is it true that you sold the field for this amount of money? And she said, yep, that's what we sold it for, and we were happy to turn it over to you and to the church and to Jesus. And Peter said, you see these guys coming in here? They just buried your husband, and now they're going to bury you for lying to God. And she falls down dead. And they take her out and they bury her. And the Bible says that fear overcame the whole company. I guess. For our purposes here, don't lie to God. Live in the truth. God already knows the good stuff and the bad stuff about you and about me. It's ridiculous to try to lie to God. And in some points, it's dangerous to do it. So Peter continues to live, and he travels around, and he preaches, and he teaches, and he does miracles, and he heals people, and he gathers to himself this reputation of being the spokesman, the leader of the apostles. And so there came a time where he was living with a guy named Simon the Tanner. He was staying with him for a while, and about a day and a half's journey away, there was a Roman centurion. A centurion is an officer over 100 soldiers. And this Roman centurion was a good guy. I mean, he prayed to God, he took care of the poor, he was honest, he was faithful in his duties, he was beloved by the people around him, even though he was part of the conquering, occupying force. And Cornelius was praying, and an angel appeared to him and said, Cornelius, God has heard your prayers and seen your good works. They ascend to him like an offering. You should send some representatives to Joppa, and you're looking for a guy named Simon, also called Peter. You'll find him at the house of Simon the Tanner. Have him come and talk to you. He's got some really important things to say to you. So Cornelius, he was a commander. He got a couple of his servants, and he got one of his soldiers, and he sent him to Joppa, right? It takes about a day and a half. So they are on their way to Joppa. They travel that whole day. The next morning, Peter is up on the roof of Simon the Tanner's house, and he's hungry, and he's waiting for lunch, and he falls into sort of a trance. And in this trance, a sheet gets lowered from heaven, right, like a bed sheet. And it's held by the four corners, and it gets opened in front of him, and inside it are all of the animals that Jews aren't supposed to eat. Right? There's lobster in there, there's pigs in there, there's shellfish in there, all the stuff that Jews aren't allowed to eat. And a voice from heaven says, Peter, get up, kill, and eat. And Peter says, certainly not. I've never eaten anything unclean. And the voice from heaven says, don't you call stuff unclean that I've made clean. And the sheet goes back up into heaven. 3 times this happens, right? Get up, kill, and eat. I've never eaten anything unclean. Don't you call unclean things that I've made clean. 3 times. The 3rd time it goes up, Peter looks, and where the sheet was blocking, there are this Roman soldier and these 2 servants, and they say, we're looking for a guy named Peter. We were told we'd find him here. And Peter understands that God was preparing him for this meeting. That he shouldn't think that Gentiles is anybody who's not a Jew, are unclean, that God has declared some of them clean. And so he goes down, he talks to them, he welcomes them into his house, which you're not supposed to do, right? Jews and Gentiles don't eat together. They don't share housing. They're not supposed to talk to each other, right? These are the Jewish rules, so that they stay pure, they stay clean from the pollution of Gentiles and Gentile beliefs. But Peter welcomes them into the house, invites them to stay all night. They stay overnight, and then the next morning they head back to Cornelius, right? So they travel that whole day, they camp out someplace. The next day, they're coming into town, and Cornelius has gathered everybody he knows in his house. And he hears from one of his guards that, there's a party approaching. It's Peter and the Roman soldier and the 2 servants, and Peter's brought 6 of his buds with him, 6 Jewish Christians with him. And Cornelius goes tearing out of his house, falls down in front of Peter and starts to worship him. And Peter's like, hey, no, absolutely not. I'm just a man like you. Picks him up. They go into the house. And Peter looks and he sees this house full of Gentiles. And he understands what God was preparing him for. And he says, I'm a good Jew, and I'm not supposed to be here. Traditionally, we're not supposed to talk to each other. We're not supposed to fellowship. I'm not supposed to be in this house. But God has told me that he's made things clean, and I should pay attention to that. And he tells them the story about the sheet, and then he tells them about Jesus. And if you're looking for a good summary about, what early preaching was about Jesus, you look right there, in Acts 10, Acts 11. And you'll see, it's not more than 3 paragraphs that Peter tells them about who Jesus was, what he did, what happened to him, what God did, raising him from the dead, right? And the Holy Spirit, like on the day of Pentecost, falls on these Gentiles. And it blows the mind of Peter's Jewish associates. They cannot believe that the Spirit of the living God has been poured out on filthy Gentiles. And they are just looking at each other. They cannot believe what they're seeing. They're looking around. And Peter says to them, look, God's Spirit's already blessed them. Who are we not to baptize them? And they say, yeah, go. So Peter baptizes, and Gentiles get brought into the company of God's people. Right. One of the other stories down below that you can read about on your own is that this was by no means a decision that wasn't that was universal. There were a lot of people in the church that thought that Peter had done a wrong thing here, that Gentiles could be saved by Jesus, but first they had to become Jews. They had to do the conversion to Judaism. They had to accept all of the rules, the surgery, everything that is part of being going from Gentile to Jew. And then, as a Jew, you could be saved by Jesus. And Peter was like, absolutely not. God has declared these people clean. The Spirit of God fell on them. We baptized them. They are just like us. We couldn't keep Moses' law. The last thing we need to do is try to get other people to keep Moses' law. So a door opens for people like me and people like you, and that's something that is just shocking in the history of the world. Peter continues to preach and to teach. Somehow he winds up in Rome. There's different stories about how he wound up there, but he winds up in Rome, and in Rome he is arrested by the Emperor Nero. We've talked about Nero before. And Nero hates Christians, and Nero decides to put Peter to death. And so Peter gets let out of prison one day. He's taken to a place where he didn't want to go. His arms are stretched out, and he sees that he is about to be crucified. Now, a lot of people, especially people who'd failed like Peter had failed previously, would say whatever they needed to say to get out of that moment. They would renounce Jesus, deny Jesus again. But Peter has learned his lesson. He has been changed by the power of Jesus. And Peter's only thing that he says to the soldiers is, I am not worthy to die like Jesus died. Can you imagine that? So the soldiers laugh at him, and they turn the cross upside down, and they crucify him upside down. And that's how Peter dies. A faithful witness to Jesus. Someone who believed it and who lived it and was willing to die for it. Someone who accepted death rather than renounce Jesus again. I don't have any reason to believe that that's ever going to be something that's requested of you or of me. I mean, we live this incredibly blessed life where there are very few consequences for us believing in Jesus, following Jesus. You need to know that around the world there are places where being a Christian still gets you killed. That you and I can't forget those brothers and sisters. We have to be praying for them if there are ways that we can help them. This is our family. We should be helping them. But I want you to see the transformation in Peter's life. I want you to see the power and the grace of God. I want you to have some sense of how blessed you are and some sense of how true this thing is. Nobody would hang on a cross upside down for 3 days if they didn't know it to be true. This is true. Jesus is alive, and he loves you. Okay, so again, out of the 13 stories, I want at least one question. Out of the 9 stories that we didn't talk about here, I want you to write me a paragraph what the story's about, so that I believe you actually read the thing. And a little bit of work would be nice. English would be good. Punctuation is always helpful. All right, I'm glad that you're clear on the assignment. I need it in. Sunday night is the time I'm hoping for, because then I can put things together for Wednesday. So let's do better about that. Know that Jesus loves you. I am delighted to be your teacher and to walk with you in this. And I will see you on Wednesday evening. Bye-bye.